Okay, this quick video will show those of you that have or want to get the movement kit. This is part 1 of 2. This part is on the player control script, which is kind of a starter kit for people that want to do games. I use almost all of my stuff that I develop is in virtual reality, though. I've never done any 2D work, so I can't attest to its usability in a 2D world. But in a 3D game, or a PC VR game, and it could be played uh, 3D on the PC as opposed to VR, but I haven't tested it with a 2D. So the player control script, this test animations, when you enable it, allows some you can test uh, each animation individually without interacting with another one, and it'll make sense as to why that's kind of important when you want to test it a little bit later on in this. Player tag name. I use that to find the player and to interact with it and detect collisions. If you tag your player with some other name, just change the value, but kind of player is built into Unity by default, so I chose that name. Property owned is kind of a mini beginner kit inventory system. So for everything in here, it has a name of something readable by a human name, uh, and then maybe a prefab would be dropped into here for the object. If it's hidden, it means they don't have it yet. If it's unhidden, then they have access to it. And so this would be a list of everything they have or can acquire in the game. Again, it's just a beginner inventory system. Movement type, I have apply force and transform position. By default, it's apply force because I found physics works a little better so you don't accidentally materialize inside of a wall or a tree or something. However, sometimes transform position works better in some games. Um, and let's see, next, enable moving. I can envision that you have a menu system up and you don't want the character to move, so you can programmatically set that, or if you want to set it and then turn it off in the game, whatever it is. Movement speed makes sense. You know what that is. It's a multiplier to the input values. This uses the new input system, and it comes with a player input system actions with some things predefined. We'll get more into that in a second. Go back to player control here. And player is running is a read-only thing. That means as opposed to walking or idle. And it's kind of up to the game. I give you the variable, and that will help with the animation tie-in later, so it uses a walking one or a running one. But how you say that the player is running is not defined in the player control script, just that you can tell it so that it will do the right thing. Player is facing is another read-only thing, and this helps you figure out which animation should be playing. Right? You can not look at it if you don't want to. Facing direction, the rotation, and facing angle relative to north. And angle is moving, or player is moving, is a similar thing, right? So they could be facing forward and walking backward, right? In which case you would want to play the walking backward animation. Enable turn left and right. Again, like a menu system might temporarily disable that. Panning up and down, moving the camera up and down. Ignore it in VR, obviously, because the head goes up and down. You don't generally pan and move your head up and down at the same time. What to pan? When I first did this, I just set it to main camera, but in this example, I switch around which one's the main camera, so I specify specifically which one to pan up and down here, just so that I could not accidentally pan the player. Pan up and down speed, that makes sense. Reverse joystick pans. Some people like it when you push forward, it moves up. Some people, when you push forward, they want it to go down. This you can programmatically change. It just reverses that. These next two are read-only values. That's the actual value it's reading from the input thing. This one may go away in your version, as some of these might, but during debugging, it can be really helpful when you're not getting the result you think. Pan angle is relative to the horizon. I don't remember if it's negative or positive, but it should be obvious that you're not 180 when you should be or something. Enable jumping is exactly that. If you do this, you cannot jump in the game. Jumping force. Tag names of ground comes in handy when like you have several let's say you're in a world with a ground and a bunch of boxes, and the player, you want to know if the player is touching, right? So rather than draw a bunch of objects over here, I do tag names. So if you tag it as a ground, you can change this to whatever you want, or add multiple. Like I have one game where there's ground and rocks, right? So if you land on a rock, it's considered on the ground. Can jump while in the air. Some games, when you're in the air and you keep hitting jump, you go higher and higher. Other games, if you hit jump while in the air, nothing happens until you're touching the ground. So you can enable that. Enable the mouse. I leave that not set by default because I find it annoying that if I focus in the game view and move the mouse over to here, it moves the game view. It drove me nuts, so by default I leave that off. And this is the XR extended reality package path for for mouse, keyboard, and this I'm using the Xbox controller. And for the XR controllers, virtual reality, you notice they're hard-coded to Oculus. I only have the Xbox controller and I only have the Oculus. So I imagine that this section will evolve over time as I discover or are told more paths for more devices. Why I do that is, like, for example, again, in the menu system, right? I can disable the gamepad and only allow the mouse pointer or the XR pointer, raycast or something, right? And I can do the same thing. I can disable both controllers or one at a time. In the script, when input comes in, it tests to see if the device is enabled. For example, when a person in a game dies in the game, I disable the controller input except for respawn, which is a programming thing. It's not really a button they hit on the keyboard. Range within degrees. There's a whole bunch of delegates in movement that I have, which we'll go over in part 2 of this player control video. So you can get notified whenever the player turns more than so many degrees. And so this is 22.5, so that's kind of like 1/8 of the, or is it 1/16 of the compass direction. So these ones up here, which were, it's tied to these. It's tied to these. These are the, I don't really use the north by north, I use the main 8 compass points. These are there because I thought I might want them and maybe I will use them, right? But it's all tied to how often. So if I'm within plus or minus 22.5 degrees of north, it'll say that player is facing north, although the actual facing direction might be 15 in here because that's less than 22. So north gives me a general direction. Moving direction will say that they're, and so on. And so I know which animation to play, so the facing versus moving thing. Gamepad dead zone. I found out that the new input system doesn't do what I thought. I'm not sure what it does, but the dead zone system on it doesn't seem to work for me on all devices. So I do it in the code, and I by default set it to what Unity was using, so that it doesn't look like a weird conflict. One of the callbacks, delegates, you can get is how, like, if the player stops moving, you can find out that they're not moving. And this is the interval. It's a floating point number. I could set it to 0.1 if I wanted. And after this much time elapses, it tosses out the delegate event player is not moving. in the animation script, for example, can automatically switch them to idle or to whatever you specify. So that's the end of this description of this one. Now for part 2 or part 1 of the animation controller.